everyone, and welcome back to another reaction video. Today we are continuing on the Napoleonic Wars series by Epic History TV. Today we are following up on the Prussian campaign of 1806 with the Battle of Friedland 1807. So without further ado, let's get going.
Epic History TV History March collaboration, supported by our sponsor Skillshare, home of more than 22,000 online classes. Find out about our exclusive special offer at the end of the video. One week before Christmas 1806, French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte arrived in the Polish city of Warsaw, then part of Prussia. A year had passed since his great victory over the Austrians and Russians at Austerlitz, and 2 months since he'd hammered the Prussians at Jena. But Russia still had powerful forces in the field, the most important of which was the Russian First Army, commanded by General Bennigsen.
Yes, a little bit of background on General Bennigsen. He is actually a German, originally from the state of Hanover. He joined the Russian army in 1773, and during that time he had risen through the ranks by fighting the Turks and Poles in various campaigns. He was also, interestingly enough, active in the conspiracy to assassinate Emperor Paul I of Russia, which is, of course, Alexander I's father. Now, he did not participate in the assassination itself, but he was active in the conspiracy. As for his generalship, well, I would say Bennigsen is neither a brilliant nor incompetent commander. He did not really stand out in a tactical or strategic sense, but he would play a very prominent role in the Napoleonic Wars, as we will see in this campaign in particular.
Napoleon would not be master of Europe until it was defeated, and Russia and Prussia forced to make peace. But that winter, Napoleon's first attempt to trap Bennigsen near Pultusk got bogged down in thick Polish mud.
Yes, Pultusk was technically a French victory, though the casualty numbers of this battle are quite disputed. However, despite having numerical and artillery superiority, Bennigsen was forced to fall back. So, yeah, but it was a pretty messy affair overall.
The Russians withdrew to Białystok. The French army, half-starved and frozen, was ordered into winter quarters. While in Warsaw, Napoleon began a famous affair with a young Polish noblewoman, Marie Walewska.
Yes, this is one of the most famous affairs Napoleon had, and he had many of them. Marie Walewska, was a young Polish noblewoman, as they said. Her influence on Napoleon's policies towards Poland is unclear. I do think she had some influence in the Polish policies of Napoleon. However, what's more interesting is actually she bore him an illegitimate son that would later become the foreign minister between 1855 and 1860 in Napoleon III's government, which kind of strengthens the case that this is Napoleon's illegitimate son. And he would play an active role as foreign minister. He helped end the Crimean War, among other things, and he would continue to serve in Napoleon III's government in various capacities. So that's just an interesting tidbit.
In the late 18th century, the once mighty Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had been swallowed up by its neighbors, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, in a series of annexations known as partitions. until in 1795, a third and final partition wiped Poland off the map.
Yes, during the 16th and 17th centuries, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had been one of the largest and most powerful states in Europe. However, like many great powers throughout history, eventually they begin to decline. And during the 18th century, you could say that the Commonwealth became little more than a Russian satellite state. Often it was the Russians who selected the Polish king, and they controlled Commonwealth policies by bribing the Polish nobility, among other ways. They influenced the Commonwealth. However, what led to the partitions was actually, during the first partition, there was something called the Bar Confederation, named after the fortress of Bar in, I believe, in the region of Podalia. Yeah, could be wrong there. Anyways, basically, some Polish nobles, the Szlachta as they were known, basically formed a confederation to resist the ever-growing influence of Russia in Commonwealth politics. And as a result, there was a conflict known as the War of the Bar Confederation. And during that war, Poland, or the Confederation, lost, and the Polish-Lithuanian lands were seized by Russia. And in the second partition resulted from the Polish-Russian War of 1792, and that war arose because of the fact that the Poles attempted constitutional reform. Russians did not approve, and war broke out. They lost. They were petitioned again, and the third time there was an uprising which was crushed by the Russians and Prussians, and then they just decided to do away with the Commonwealth altogether. And if you know anything about Polish history, you know this is unfortunately a pattern that repeats itself. I'm thinking of Hitler's and Stalin's annexation of Poland during World War II, for one. But that's just a bit of background on how Poland became partitioned.
Now, Polish patriots looked to Napoleon as their savior, praying that his victories against their occupiers would lead to the rebirth of a Polish state.
And funnily enough, if you read the lyrics of the Polish national anthem, Napoleon is actually mentioned in it, and is still so today. So that tells you something about how the Poles viewed Napoleon, and still view him.
Marie Walewska became Napoleon's mistress in order to further this cause. Ordinary French soldiers, however, had little love for Poland. It was impoverished, freezing, and they missed home. Desertion rates soared. There were even 100 cases of suicide. Marshal Ney, commanding 6th Corps, sent patrols towards Heilsberg, looking for better quarters. What they found were Russian and Prussian soldiers on the move. They'd stumbled into a surprise winter attack by Bennigsen.
Now, Ney had express orders not to do this, because Napoleon feared it could provoke a Russian winter offensive. Now, it seems to me that Bennigsen had already planned to do this regardless of Ney's activities, but, it looked that way to Napoleon. Anyways, the winter offensive here by Bennigsen was a pretty bold stunt, but as we will see, were it not for certain circumstances, Bennigsen could have easily been entrapped and destroyed by Napoleon at this stage of the campaign.
Napoleon quickly laid a trap for the Russian army. ordering Ney and Bernadotte to retreat and lure Bennigsen west, while he led the rest of the army north to fall on his flank and rear. But the Russians captured a French courier carrying the Emperor's orders to Marshal Bernadotte. Bennigsen now...
Yeah, this is what I was talking about. If Marshal Bernadotte's orders were not intercepted, it's very likely Bennigsen would have been destroyed right then and there.
Warned of the trap, ordered a retreat, fighting a series of rearguard skirmishes against the pursuing French. But he refused to give up the city of Königsberg without a fight, and turned to give battle at Eylau.
What a massacre, and without any result, Marshal Ney on the Battle of Eylau.
The Battle of Eylau, fought over 2 days, was one of the most brutal of the Napoleonic Wars, fought in freezing conditions, with neither side backing down. Marshal Augereau's 7th Corps, advancing into the face of a snowstorm, lost its way and was cut to pieces by Russian cannon fire. 5 French Eagles were lost. Napoleon's army was only saved by a devastating massed cavalry charge by 10,000 horsemen, led by the fearless Marshal Murat, and remembered as one of the great cavalry charges in history. At Eylau, for the first time...
Yes, and there were several key factors playing into the... well, not defeat, but the heavy losses the French forces took at this battle. First of all, Bennigsen had the advantage of having his forces concentrated, while Napoleon's army, some of the corps were still strung out on the march to the battlefield. The weather also favored the Russians. The blizzard was flying in the face of the French, so when they advanced, they couldn't really see where they were going, and as they said, Marshal Augereau's 7th Corps lost its way and was virtually annihilated during the course of the battle. Now, Bennigsen also had superior amounts of artillery, perhaps as many as 100 more artillery pieces than what Napoleon could muster at this battle. In addition, what happened was that the French center was on the verge of buckling, and it was only saved, as they said, by Marshal Murat's very bold but suicidal mass cavalry charge of 10,000 horsemen. Murat paid a heavy price for this. He lost maybe 1,000, 1,500 cavalrymen, and considering how valuable they were and how long it took to train new cavalrymen, this was a big loss for Napoleon. But it bought enough time for Napoleon to get some reinforcements to the battlefield, and it brought some relief to the center. It should also be mentioned that during the battle, Napoleon was nearly captured, but he was saved by some of his guard units. So yeah, it was a close call all around, and very bloody for both sides.
As Emperor, Napoleon failed to win a clear victory on the battlefield. He and the Russians covered up the true scale of their losses.
Yeah, just look at those numbers.
Both sides are estimated to have lost 1/3 of their armies in the carnage. After the horrors of Eylau, both armies sought time to rest and recover. Meanwhile, the newly formed French 10th Corps under Marshal Lefebvre besieged Danzig, held by 13,000 Prussians under General Kalkreuth. The city came under heavy French bombardment and infantry assault. After 8 weeks, with no prospect of reinforcement, the Prussian garrison surrendered on the 27th of May. Napoleon's northern sea flank was now secure against any possible Russian landing. The French Emperor now commanded an army 190,000 strong, against just 115,000 Russian and Prussian troops. But it was Bennigsen who moved first, launching a surprise attack against Ney's 6th Corps on the 5th of June. Ney conducted a brilliant fighting withdrawal.
Yes, Ney was certainly the wrong commander Bennigsen chose to attack, because Ney would later on gain a famous reputation for excelling at retreats and fighting against the odds, especially during the Russian campaign of 1812. But yes, Ney was outnumbered 4-1, but despite that he was able to withdraw in good order. Bennigsen's surprise attack failed, and this is a pattern we will see repeat at Friedland, with Bennigsen trying to surprise and quickly destroy a French corps before withdrawing.
And escaped. Bennigsen, having lost the element of surprise, and with Napoleon advancing, retreated once more. 4 days later at Heilsberg, the French lost 10,000 men in a botched assault against Russian defences.
Yes, Bennigsen had taken up some pretty strong defensive positions around Heilsberg. Napoleon threw men to overwhelm the defenses, and, well, Bennigsen made them pay a very heavy price. 10,000 casualties, not a great way to start the spring offensive of 1807. But Bennigsen was forced to withdraw nonetheless.
But the Russians continued their retreat the next day. Napoleon thought Bennigsen would head north to Königsberg, but instead he retreated northeast, keeping to the east bank of the Aller River. So when Napoleon's army marched north, it was Marshal Lannes' reserve corps.
Yes, this was a bit of a strategic mistake from Napoleon. He didn't focus on either going after Bennigsen's army or capturing Königsberg. Instead, he tried to sort of do both things. So he detached about half his army to go towards Königsberg, and he sent Lannes' reserve corps to watch the Aller River crossings, and he himself stayed somewhere in the middle, prepared to reinforce either flank if necessary, which seems like a smart move. However, the distance between Napoleon's reserves and the troops heading towards Königsberg was pretty significant, about 50 miles or so they wouldn't be able to immediately reinforce Napoleon if something went wrong. But yeah, that's what happened here.
On his right flank that next encountered the Russian army, near the small town of Friedland.
And I should say, clarify that the objective was not to seize Königsberg itself, but to force the Russians to commit to fighting there, because this was sort of the last outpost of Prussia that was not under occupation. Königsberg is also very symbolically important. It is the old Prussian capital, still the royal capital at this stage, but the main capital was of course in Berlin. Ride your horse into the ground if you have to, but tell the Emperor we're fighting the entire Russian army, Marshal Lannes to his aide-de-camp. Yes, so it became quite desperate there at the outset of the Battle of Friedland.
In the late afternoon of the 13th of June, Russian cavalry scouts informed General Bennigsen that they'd found a single French corps at Friedland. Bennigsen decided he had time to cross the Aller River and smash this isolated corps before the rest of the French army could arrive to save it. And he ordered his army to begin crossing the river. Marshal Lannes, commanding 16,000 men and facing 46,000 Russians, sent an urgent message to Napoleon.
Yes, Bennigsen at this point, his army was down to about 60,000 men, and partly due to battle attrition, but also because he has sent reinforcements to Königsberg. So he's left with around 60,000 men at Friedland, and he manages to get about 46,000 to cross the river, and then he held back the rest on the other side of the river. And yes, his idea here was like like in Gutstadt, to smash Lannes' isolated core before Napoleon could intervene. And once again, he sort of badly underestimates, like many others did in the beginning of the Napoleonic Wars, how fast Napoleon's corps are able to respond and move to reinforce a position.
That he was under attack from the main Russian army. Then he fought a skillful delaying action, hiding the weakness of his force behind a large screen of skirmishers, while gradually yielding ground to the...
Yes, Lannes was a brilliant commander, one of the best commanders of the Napoleonic Wars, and this battle shows it. He was able to conduct a very skillful delaying battle using skirmishes, which the French were experts at skirmishing, that is, and he was able to hide his weakness and gradually back off, not letting Bagration's advance guard here crush them immediately.
Enemy. Lannes was still holding off the Russians as darkness fell. That night, Russian engineers built 3 pontoon bridges at Friedland to speed the movement of troops over the river.
Yes, this move makes sense because you want to get more troops over faster. However, I question the location of these pontoon bridges. All of them lead into Friedland, which means when all of these troops cross into Friedland, the town itself becomes a bottleneck because of its narrow streets and all that. It couldn't possibly handle this many troops. And so, yeah, even though the intention was to clear the bottleneck by constructing more bridges, in reality, it didn't really speed up the movement of troops since they were stuck in Friedland trying to navigate out of it.
But Bennigsen was taking a huge risk. If this turned into a major battle, his army would have to fight with its back to the river and the steep banks of the Mill Stream dividing its left wing from its right. Bennigsen had also badly underestimated the speed at which Napoleon's Grande Armée would react. The first French reinforcements arrived that night.
Yes, Bennigsen's position here is almost hilariously bad. He has his back to the river. There are limited crossing points. His left wing is divided from his right wing, and even though he constructed pontoon bridges between the mill stream, in the mill stream, to try to bridge the divide, so to speak, it was only a partially helpful measure.
The Emperor himself wasn't far behind.
We won't catch the enemy making a mistake like this twice.
By dawn on the 14th of June, about 40,000 Russians had crossed to the west bank of the Aller River. Bennigsen ordered an attack on the village of Heinrichsdorf to turn the French left flank. But French cavalry reinforcements, led by General Grouchy, intercepted the Russians.
Some of you may remember the name Grouchy. Grouchy is the famous commander who failed to march to Napoleon's aid at the Battle of Waterloo. But before this, he was quite a good cavalry general. And we'll talk more about Marshal Grouchy in the future, I can assure you that.
More than an hour of charge and countercharge, the French horsemen finally drove the Russians back. Marshal Mortier's 8th Corps now arrived to reinforce the French centre. In Sortlac Wood, General Oudinot's elite Grenadier Division fought stubbornly against Prince Bagration's left wing, but was outnumbered by the Russians and gradually pushed back. Around noon on a sweltering day, Napoleon himself arrived. He was soon followed by 1st Corps, commanded by General Victor, standing in for the wounded Marshal Bernadotte, as well as Ney's 6th Corps and the Imperial Guard under Marshal Bessières.
Yeah, at this point, Napoleon has about 80,000 men on the field. Bennigsen still in the mid 40,000, 45, 46,000 maybe. Somewhere around 40 to 46,000. So yeah, he's badly outnumbered at this point.
The date, the 14th of June, held special significance for Napoleon. It was the 7th anniversary of his great victory over the Austrians at Marengo. A good omen, he declared. The battle then entered a lull, as Napoleon assessed the situation, saw Bennigsen's dangerous position, and issued orders for an attack to take advantage of it. Bennigsen, meanwhile, who was tormented by ill health throughout the day, saw that he now faced the full might of Napoleon's army, and issued orders for a retreat.
Now, I do believe Bennigsen's original plan was to fight during the day here and withdraw under the cover of darkness, which is a good plan, but he would have needed to hold out maybe as much as 5 hours before daylight disappeared. And he simply did not have the strength to hold out that long against this many troops. And he did make the right call in sounding the withdrawal, but there was no way this was going to end happily for Bennigsen. This was just, considering Friedland is the choke point that it is, and the limited amount of pontoon bridges, yeah, it's gonna be absolute chaos. This is the objective: advance looking neither right nor left, but bore into this thick mass.
But before Bennigsen's retreat could get underway, at 5:30 p.m., 3 salvos from the French guns signalled the start of Napoleon's attack. It was led by Ney's 6th Corps on the right wing, who first cleared Bagration's infantry from Sortlac Wood. But as Ney's troops left the cover of the trees, they came under heavy fire from Russian cannon across the river. As the French attack faltered, Prince Bagration rallied his men and launched a cavalry counterattack. Ney's corps retreated. But now General Victor's 1st Corps came up on his left. Its artillery commander, General Senarmont, advanced with 30 guns and blasted the Russians at point-blank range with case shot.
Yes, if you don't know, case shot is basically turns a cannon into a giant shotgun, basically, and it was stupendously efficient at mowing down troops at close range. But that's just the problem. It required you to be really close, and it was rare that you were able to position artillery in such a way. But General Senarmont, to his credit, was able to do this with 30 guns, and he is said to have come within 120 yards within Bagration's lines at this point, and apparently his guns mowed down about many as killed or wounded as many as 4,000 Russian troops, which is absolutely insane. And this only took maybe a few minutes to do. Napoleon was impressed enough to make General Senamont a baron of the empire after this battle, and it really cemented the position of artillery as the king of the battlefield of this era.
Hundreds of Russians were mown down within minutes. Under this onslaught, Bagration's men began to waver and then retreat. Around 7 p.m., the Russian Imperial Guard launched a desperate counterattack to try to halt the...
Now, one might think that the Russian artillery support on the other side of the river might have helped the Russians stave off this catastrophe. However, the French guns had by this point focused their fire on that position and silenced the Russian batteries. So yeah, they didn't have much artillery support at this stage of the battle. The Russians, that is.
The French advance on Friedland, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. As exploding shells began to start fires in Friedland, the French centre and left wing joined the attack. With its only escape route under threat, the entire Russian army began a panicked retreat towards the river. But Friedland's houses and bridges were now ablaze. The town became a deadly trap for the Russians. Many were drowned trying to cross the river, others killed or captured.
It should be mentioned that some people ask, well, why didn't they just swim over? Well, first of all, consider the chaos around you. You are fleeing from infantry, from cavalry. There's artillery shells flying all over the place. So you'd be panic struck, I would imagine. And then there is this case of, well, many people actually didn't know how to swim. It's a very common skill today, of course, but back then it wasn't as common to know how to swim. And so, you know, many drowned desperately trying to flee. But yeah, just look at this picture. It's like a total disaster for Russia at this point.
North of Friedland, some units were able to escape across a ford or along the riverbank. But there was no disguising the Russians' terrible defeat.
Now, the Russian defeat could have been very much worse if General Grouchy and his cavalry had pursued more vigorously the fleeing Russians, which they didn't do for some unclear reason. Napoleon had issued orders to this effect to Grouchy, but Grouchy claimed he did not receive any such orders. So this whole thing is sort of shrouded in mystery, as is often the case when you're dealing with older history, where things have not been as well documented. And of course we can't ask any of the involved parties about truth, so yeah, just an interesting tidbit there.
The Battle of Friedland was one of the most decisive victories of Napoleon's career.
Yes, it was.
At the cost of 10,000 casualties, he had inflicted twice as many losses on the Russians. About 20,000 men, killed, wounded or taken prisoner. 40% of Bennigsen's army. The Prussians abandoned Königsberg the next day, which was occupied by Soult's 4th Corps, while Bennigsen's shattered army retreated across the river Niemen into Russia. Tsar Alexander's advisors implored him to make peace with Napoleon. He accepted their advice, and a ceasefire was agreed.
Perhaps I was happiest at Tilsit. I find myself victorious, dictating laws, having emperors and kings pay me court. Napoleon in exile on St. Helena. And yes, I believe this is how Napoleon truly felt. This is where he stood at the apex of his military career. And it was sort of downhill from here, even though Napoleon would continue to enjoy success on the battlefield. But this is the true glory days of the First French Empire.
Alexander and Napoleon met for the first time aboard a raft in the middle of the river Niemen, near Tilsit, and developed an immediate rapport. Tilsit proved to be one of history's great diplomatic summits, as the two emperors feted each other for days, with banquets, parades and concerts, then discussed affairs late into the night.
Yes, Alexander and Napoleon really hit it off, as symbolized by this depiction. They got pretty close, and they admired each other. They were both fairly young emperors, and, you know, they had the world in their hands, so to speak. Together they could have dominated Europe, but alas, it was not to be, and this relationship would quickly devolve with the years.
A friendship of sorts developed, while Russia's former ally, King Frederick William of Prussia, was left out in the cold. And it was Prussia who would lose most in the treaties of Tilsit, signed 2 weeks later.
Yes, Prussia would lose an astonishing amount. They were such big losers in the treaties of Tilsit, and the conditions were so harsh that Queen Louise of Prussia personally implored Napoleon to give them more modest terms, but Napoleon was not interested in compromise pieces. He would impose probably one of the harshest pieces imaginable on Prussia, as we will see soon.
1/3 of Prussian territory was taken away.
Yes, the narrative says 1/3. It's actually more like half.
To create the new Kingdom of Westphalia, to be ruled by Napoleon's 22-year-old brother, Jerome.
We discussed Jerome.
And the Duchy
before.
of Warsaw, to be ruled by the King of Saxony, which Polish patriots hoped would prove a stepping stone on the road to their own state. Polish troops were recruited into the Grande Armée, with Polish lancers even forming part of Napoleon's elite Imperial Guard.
Yes, Polish troops were recruited into the French Grande Armée, and Polish troops would prove to be very reliable, very good, well motivated and disciplined. And as they said, Polish lancers formed part of Napoleon's elite cavalry contingents, and they were very deadly when used. So yeah, overall, this was a great boon for Napoleon by creating this semi-autonomous Polish state. He got a new source of manpower for his armies, and he also kept the Polish people on his side, and that would be very important in the campaigns to come.
Russia only had to give up the Ionian Islands, as Alexander accepted an alliance with Napoleon that left the French Emperor master of Europe.
Yes, and some additional terms in the secret articles of the Treaties of Tilsit. Alexander accepted that France would try to mediate on their behalf with the Ottoman Empire, and if the Ottoman Empire would not accept the terms proposed, the Russians would be given free rein to invade and seize territory from the Ottoman Empire. They were also given permission to seize Finland from Sweden. And in exchange, Alexander promised to mediate with the British, and if the British would not accept mediation, then they would join the continental system, which I'm sure we will discuss very soon here.
Alexander even agreed to join the continental system, Napoleon's economic blockade of Great Britain.
Oh, before we move on, I should also mention some other parts of the Treaties of Tilsit that were included. First of all, Prussia was forced to limit its army to 42,000 men. That's down from around 80,000. They could mobilize before. They could mobilize more if they wanted to, but that was around the standing army size. And of course, they were forced to pay an indemnity of 120 million franc. And also, these were seen as, of course, half its territory was seized. The French foreign minister at this time, Talleyrand, one of the most brilliant diplomats of this age, he implored Napoleon to seek milder terms. Napoleon wanted a maximalist peace, and such he dismissed Talleyrand's proposals. Talleyrand also tried to get a softer, milder peace for Austria in 1805. It was also rejected back then. So Talleyrand fell out with Napoleon over foreign policy at this stage, and it would come back to bite Napoleon, you could say, to not have Talleyrand in his corner. And there is some merit to his arguments that a milder peace towards these countries wouldn't have left them so much seeking. They wouldn't seek revenge in the same way that they would eventually do in the later campaigns. So yeah, there might be something to his arguments.
Which banned British ships and goods from all French-controlled ports. The system had been established the previous winter by Napoleon's Berlin Decree. Napoleon hoped that by cutting off British trade with Europe, he'd cause financial chaos and political upheaval in Britain, allowing him to make a favourable peace. There was just one problem. The continental system didn't work.
Yes, and why didn't it work? Well, when you're going about the enormous task of policing the entire coastlines of Europe, then you need naval supremacy to do so, and France was nowhere near having naval supremacy. After Trafalgar, their fleet was smashed, and even though Napoleon had quite an ambitious shipbuilding program, breaking the British naval dominance anytime soon was wholly unrealistic. What is the alternative then? Well, you would have to police all the coastlines of Europe on land, which would stretch the French forces so thin. Imagine the length of the European coastline. It's pretty much impossible task. And of course, the system was undermined by widespread smuggling. People were not happy to be cut off from their British goods, and people like to do trade with Britain. Understandably so. Yes, the system did hurt British trade, but the damage was even more significant on French trade and economic activity.
Not only was it impossible to enforce and undermined by widespread smuggling, the system damaged French trade just as much as British trade. The decisive weapon in this economic war would prove to be the British Royal Navy, which that summer ensured its continued naval dominance by launching a preemptive strike against the neutral Danish fleet at Copenhagen, capturing their warships before they could fall into Napoleon's hands. Royal Navy squadrons blockaded all major French ports, seizing any ships trading with France, while ensuring British merchants could continue to trade overseas in relative safety. The Navy even seized the tiny Danish island of Heligoland as a base for smuggling British goods into Europe. But most disastrously for Napoleon, the continental system would draw him into two conflicts that proved ruinous for his empire.
Yes. What happens when a country refuses or doesn't want to, refuses outright or doesn't enforce the continental system? Well, then you have to go in and make sure the rules are enforced. And how do you do that? You invade their country, of course. That's how you did back then.
The first would be fought in the Iberian Peninsula, where Napoleon decided to force Britain's ally, Portugal, to join the continental system. In November 1807, French troops, supported by their Spanish ally, invaded the country. The Portuguese royal family fled to their colony of Brazil as the French occupied Lisbon without a fight. It looked as though Napoleon had won yet another easy victory. But the Peninsular War was just beginning.
Yes, next time we will be watching Napoleon's invasion of Spain, one of the most horrendous and most one of the most bloody conflicts in modern European history. So I look forward to that. But until then, please leave a comment if you have anything to add, like the video, and subscribe for more content. And I'll see you guys next time.